When you create a multimedia instructional material, be it PowerPoint, video, chart and graph, diagram, illustration, photo, animation, interactive simulation, or audio podcast, there are certain principles that you should keep in mind to make it more effective for teaching and learning. In this video, you'll be introduced to the 14 principles of multimedia learning that will greatly enhance the quality and effectiveness of your teaching on instructional materials. The first principle I want to talk about is Multimedia Principle. According to this principle, you get deeper learning from words and pictures than from words alone. This is an example of using both words and pictures for a PowerPoint slide. And this is an example of using words alone to present the same information in PowerPoint. Which do you find more effective, with pictures or without pictures? By providing both verbal and visual information, they both complement each other to help us understand the information faster, more thoroughly, and easily. Now let's talk about Modality Principle. According to this principle, we get deeper learning when words are presented as narration rather than as on-screen text. Let me use this picture to demonstrate this principle. First, I'm going to use narration instead of on-screen text to present some important facts.
It's me. In June 2011, I had about 51 pounds of body fat, and July 11th, little less than 4 weeks later, I had 36 pounds of body fat. So it was 15 pounds of body fat loss in about 3-4 weeks. The extra time I dedicated for this transformation was only about an hour a day.
Okay, in my next example, I'm not going to use a narration, but instead, I'm going to use on-screen text to present the same facts, and you'll be reading it instead of listening to me speaking. Here we go. Many teachers create a PowerPoint slide like this for their students to look at. Slides like this are easy to make, but for students learning, it's usually more effective to use voice-over narration rather than on-screen text. It's pretty easy to add voice-over narration to a slide and turn it into a video. So if you want to be more effective, you can't be lazy. Adding to the previous principle, you should also consider Redundancy Principle. According to this principle, we get deeper learning when words are presented as narration rather than as both narration and on-screen text. Let's take a look at the earlier example.
It's me. In June 2011, I had about 51 pounds of body fat, and July 11th, little less than 4 weeks later, I had 36.
In this example, I was explaining the core message orally. Generally speaking, when you do that, you don't have to do this.
It's me. In June 2011.
The on-screen text is pretty much like a duplicate of what you're speaking. In that case, there's no need for you to add text. Students should be paying attention to the picture on the slide and you're speaking. In an example like this, doing this, in other words, listening to what the speaker is saying while reading the on-screen text and looking at the picture, does not produce deeper learning. The next principle is Spatial Contiguity Principle. According to this principle, we get deeper learning when corresponding text and pictures or animations are presented near rather than far from each other on the screen. This is an example of placing corresponding text and pictures close to each other. And this is an example of placing corresponding text and pictures far from each other. Which was easier for you to comprehend the message on the screen? I bet it was this one. With this example, you have to mentally make connections between the pictures and the text like this, while listening to the speaker's explanation. This example is easy enough for most viewers to process, but in severe cases of spatial discontiguity, it causes split attention and extraneous cognitive load on the viewer's part, and it makes it really hard for the viewer to understand and follow. As the name implies, this principle deals with temporal contiguity. According to the Temporal Contiguity Principle, We get deeper learning when corresponding narration and pictures or animations are presented simultaneously rather than successively. In other words, you need to synchronize what you're saying with what you're showing. I'm going to show you two examples now. In my first example, I'm going to present both picture and narration simultaneously, which is the right way. Then I'm going to do the wrong way after that. So this is the right way. Here we go.
When your body is in a anabolic state, in other words, in a state of muscle building, all the amino acids in your system and all the amino acids you consume are going to be used for muscle synthesis.
Now the wrong way. Very strong hormonal processes are taking place in your brain.
When your body is in a anabolic state, in other words, in a state of muscle building, all the amino acids in your system and all the amino acids you consume are going to be used for muscle synthesis.
Believe it or not, many people do it the wrong way quite frequently. This temporal discontiguity forces the audience to mentally hold earlier information while attending to the new information. At the same time, it also forces the audience to make connections between the new content and the previous content. It requires the audience to have pretty good memory as well as a strong working memory capacity. So it's not suited for little kids, for example, who can't hold much information for an extended period of time. The next principle is called Coherence Principle. According to this principle, we get deeper learning when extraneous narration, sounds, images, and video are excluded rather than included. What do we mean by extraneous? What we mean by extraneous here is anything that does not pertain to conveying the core message you are trying to get across to the audience. So stay focused, pare down to essentials. So don't put non-essentials like this example. More is not necessarily better if it does not pertain to the core message. Don't get sidetracked by something totally irrelevant. Again, stay focused, pare down to essentials. Believe it or not, even doing something like this adds extraneous elements to this image. There's a mismatch between the picture backgrounds, which are white, and the slide background, which is green. But if you do this, it's like there's nothing in the background at all. With this example, our brains basically process the white backgrounds as separate additional backgrounds or elements, while in this example, our brains see no background. So there's no background for our brains to process, so it's less extraneous to our brains. The next principle is called Interactivity Principle. According to this principle, we get deeper learning when we are allowed to control the presentation rate than when we are not. Video recordings usually allow you to pause, go back and forward, and repeat as many times as you want. This is an advantage of pre-recorded video over live presentation. Next principle is Signaling Principle. According to this principle, people learn better when the words include cues about the organization of the presentation. So you might want to say things like, in this video, you'll be learning this and this and that. Well, let me give you an example of blah blah blah. You may also use on-screen text like these examples. Cues and signals can also include shapes and images. Like in this example, this simple sign can make a strong suggestion that viewers need to stop or pause. The next principle is Segmenting Principle. According to this principle, people learn better when multimedia lesson is presented in learner-paced segments rather than as continuous unit. This is similar to the Interactivity Principle we previously talked about. For instance, I have segmented this very lesson video that you're watching right now into 14 different principles or sections. And because it's a video, you can stop this lesson after each section and continue on from where you left off later on. So if you want to, you can study one principle at a time with this video. The next principle is called Pre-Teaching Principle. According to this principle, people learn better from a multimedia lesson when they know the names and characteristics of the main concepts. One way to do this is you include in your lesson a section for introducing the audience to the necessary prior knowledge or background information. Another way to implement the pre-teaching principle is to provide the audience with a handout or study guide for them to go through before they begin the actual lesson. The next principle is called Personalization Principle. According to this principle, people learn better when words are in conversational style rather than formal style. So try to talk to the audience rather than speaking to the empty space or simply reading a manuscript aloud. The next principle is called Voice Principle. According to this principle, people learn better when words are spoken in a standard accented human voice than in a machine voice or a foreign accented human voice. The next principle is called Image Principle. According to this principle, people do not necessarily learn better from a multimedia lesson when the speaker's image is added to the screen. This mainly talks about creating a video lecture or a presentation. So for example, putting my face or headshot like this is not usually necessary, and it's not even desirable if there's actual content that viewers should be paying attention to on the screen like this. That viewers should rather be paying attention to on the screen like this. And the last principle I'm going to talk about here is Individual Differences Principle. This principle talks about two learner characteristics. The first characteristic is design effects are stronger for low knowledge learners than for high knowledge learners. And the number two characteristics, design effects are stronger for high spatial learners than for low spatial learners. So let's talk about the first learner characteristic first. If you possess a lot of knowledge about what I'm talking about right now, you would understand me okay, even if my presentation sucked. But if you don't know much about what I'm talking about right now, how I organize this lecture and how I present it makes a huge difference in how much you will get out of this lecture. Now let's talk about the second learner characteristic. You put a lot of effort and apply multimedia learning and graphic design principles to your instruction material. But much of these principles are dependent on our cognitive architecture or abilities to process visual elements. Suppose we use an image like this for a presentation. For high spatial learners like us adults, it will most likely help us visualize and understand its elements and element interactivity and relationship in its image. But for low spatial learners such as little kids, they may not benefit from this as much as adults do because it is a little too complicated. On the other hand, this is much simpler, and low spatial learners such as little kids will have no problem processing this image. So now you have them all. Next time you create a multimedia instructional material, keep these principles in mind and try to apply as many of these principles as you can. It will greatly enhance the quality and effectiveness of your teaching and instructional materials.